I was going to bring up for everybody here that my granddad, Walter, is the one that led the family up here. And he had dreams of Alaska that went back right after he got out of the service in World War I. He visited Wyatt Earp, who was a friend of the Short family. And Wyatt said, Walt, Alaska's got room for a young man to grow. You ought to go up there. And it took Pappy that's what we call my granddad, Pappy. It took him quite a while to get up here, but Dad can tell you a little bit about how he had signed up early in the 30s to go up to the Mat-Su Valley.
Yeah, he was a Marine in World War I, and he was at Bellewood and some of those other places. And they come back, Congress voted in a $1,000 bonus for them. And of course they didn't have any money, so it went by for a couple of years, and then they got $500 of it, and Dad married my mom and went out and homesteaded in the desert in Arizona. And it is a little town, I forgot what it's called now, but at that time it was called Notaburg, which in Spanish was Nothingburg. And 70, 80 years later, it is still nothing there. They were going to get water, or hoped they would, and they never did. But anyway, my dad was a moving guy, and we moved to Colorado, and in 36, they had this thing going for the Matanuska Valley, they were going to give them, especially veterans that had their first chance at homesteads there. So he tried to get on, but they'd all filled up. So Pap said, to hell with it, we'll just go up there. But, so we loaded everything in an old 28 Chevy four-cylinder Ford with a trailer on it, and chugged up the mountains and over got to Oregon. And my brother Duke, which is 4 years younger than me, he'd been run over his hip with a potato wagon with 5 tons of spud on it. And the old country doctor said, oh, that boy, he's didn't take an x-ray or anything, and he'll be a little sore. So a year or so later is when we got out to Eugene, Oregon, and he was complaining, so he took him to the doctor, and the x-ray showed that it was just a sliver of bone left in his hip socket. The rest of it was all decayed. So they wanted to cut his leg off, and Dad went around to several doctors, and finally he went and said, well, let's put him in a cast for a year or so and see what happens. So they had a cast on him on his right leg from his ankle up through here, and he had all appropriate holes. And when you get the itch in there, I remember we used to get spoons to get down there and scratch him through those holes, And so that sidetracked our trip to Alaska. And this might sound crazy to you, or unbelievable almost, but I was 15, and I'd been, working for nothing all through the Depression. And when the war started, things were picking up a little bit. I was working on a farm, I think 35 cents an hour, and boy, really making it big. And my dad was a carpenter, and so he tried to get me on a job as apprentice carpenter in Corvallis. They were doing some work. Well, I went down there, and he looked at this kid, and I probably looked younger than 15. But he said, why don't you take Wayne down to the Carpenters Union and see what you can get him in? So I went down there, and all they wanted was the money. So I got on as a one-year apprentice, or first-year apprentice. And so the first job I had was in Vanport City. It was right across from Portland there with Kaiser. They had the shipyards there, and they were building this housing for the shipyard workers. So I was there about a year, and they advanced me up to third-year apprentice. And so, what was it, early part of 43, in the spring, Dad and I got on the old North Sea and came to Juneau, and we went up to the what is it?
Union Hall, maybe?
Well, yeah, where they, tell you about jobs and stuff. And so they had a spot up at Haynes. They were building that Haynes cutoff. And so we went up there and went to work there. And, oh boy, the journeyman carpenter was getting $1.35 an hour, and I was getting $1.12. Boy, I was just banking the money. You couldn't believe it. And of course, just about the time, and it's during the summers where you could work 12, 14 hours a day if you wanted. And my dad was one of those guys that worked a little while and he had to move on. So he wanted to go back home. So I was pretty disgruntled, but finally I went back, and I had promised I wouldn't join the service, before I was 17, but I did the day after I got home. I did, and I was in there 4 years, and so then in 46, I came back from the South Pacific, and they were all ready to come up here. Well, I'll come back. Go back to Dad had worked as a carpenter at Tyee, and so he had that spot, and he'd kind of scoped out Surprise Harbor on the west side of Murder Cove. So we moved out there, and we stayed there, I think, about 7 years. And then my brother and I, we bought that little outfit at Warm Springs Bay, the store and the bathhouse and the liquor store. And there were several cabins and apartments there. And we had that until we moved to Petersburg in 71. So
how many people out there at Warm Springs when you were first started there?
There was Sadie Fenton and her partner.
O'Neill.
Oh, yeah. God,
Fred
I'm
O'Neill.
losing my brain. What is it? Fred O'Neill.
Yeah, Fred O'Neill.
And he was. They had the business there, or one of them, and he hopped a ride on it with a troller going into Sitka in the fall, and they got in a storm up around Kelp Bay, and it went down, and so Sadie couldn't take care of it herself, so my brother and I bought her out, and then we got her mother to take care of the business when we were going fishing in the summers.
There was a post office there,
Yeah.
and Grandma was the postmistress. And if you come across a real old globe, you'll see Baranoff marked there because it was a post office. There was
Yeah.
a post office there.
Yeah, Fred.
O'Neill.
The other Fred.
Bohovic.
Fred Bohovic had it there until he moved. He had it as a postmaster, and then when he moved to Sitka, well, then Mom took it, and then finally Barb.
I think it was still there when Wally took over.
Yeah, I
because-
think it
because
was.
his wife Alice became postmistress.
Yeah, I think so. I think they discontinued it after that or
Discontinued
something.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
Now we just get other people to bring mail out. I was out there last winter at Warm Springs. They hired me as the winter watchman, so I learned a lot about keeping snow blowers going. But we were really lucky. It was only 14 feet of snow out there last winter. And I had expected more like 30.
Yeah.
That was not uncommon.
One winter, we had, I think it was 22 or 24 feet, and there was between the store building and the walk that goes up, where you could push snow off of the walk, but there was an area in there that was a little cabin to the right, or going just before you got to the store, and so that built up all the way past the store, and down to the ramp. And I was shoveling that stuff and, thinking about, it got to be nice to have a tunnel in there. So I finally dawned on me that I had that hot water hose, and a fire hose. And so I just put the nozzle on and built me a tunnel through there for about 70 feet. And it was still there. And the latter part of May, it was still, it was kind of melting, but slowly. No, it was really a snow hole.
One of the things we used to do out there in the winter, we didn't really pay attention to how many deer you were allowed to take. When the weather was right, Pappy would say go out and get 10 or 12 deer, and it's good smoking weather. But we did take care of the resource because the snow would get terribly deep and there'd be a cliff at the tide line, and the deer would jump down to get to the beach kelp and the grass, and then they drowned because they couldn't get back up.
Yeah,
So
we
we
cut
would be
trees
down
down
past
there
them.
and stuff for them sometimes so they could eat.
And
But we kept the freezer full, and then we smoked and ham. You take deer ham and loin, roll them up, and salt and sugar cure them or something, and a little bit, and then put them in the smokehouse. They're really choice. You can't hardly tell a deer ham from
I fooled
a
people
good
that
pork
think it
ham
was
if
corned beef at
if
times.
if it's
Yeah. But we'd break down these paths for them and prune trees so they had something to eat. And then it seems like every winter, we'd find some little ones that had been born late in the spring. They were just too small and just couldn't keep up with the rest of the herd with their mom, and they'd be trapped. So we'd pack them home, and Dad would always build up a little corral, and we'd be out there feeding them all winter. And come springtime, we'd kick off some of the fence and herd them out.
yeah, they wouldn't want to
Just to
leave.
ensure
though.
that we had
Yeah.
deer all
I can-
the time.
I forgot what we remember. Pasquale. we
Yeah,
had one,
Pasquami, yeah, that was.
and we named them all.
They all had names, but that's the only one I recall
Yeah.
is Pasquami. Now, Duke and Dutch, Dad's brothers, my uncles, they smoked Lucky Strikes or Camel Straights, and so did Granddad. But they'd have a pack of cigarettes there, and then when they went out to see the deer would come out and start nosing that
They
pack
loved
of
that
cigarettes.
cigarette.
They loved the tobacco.
Yeah.
So they, depending upon how deep into the winter and how many packages they still had, they'd break some off and give them to us boys to feed the deer. Because the deer all like that tobacco.
Oh yeah.
Now, what I understand from reading about it is that the nicotine in it helps kill stomach parasites. So that's why they wanted
Well,
to
it's
eat it.
probably natural. Something natural in it.
Yeah.
Just think what those smokers, what they were doing good for their body.
That's something they wanted.
Yeah.
But I remember one time, there was some deer stuck in the snow like that, and I went to pick up a small one and bring it back, and it kicked me right here. I had 3 loose teeth for about a week.
Well, they
So
can kick.
even stuck in the snow and starving, they've got tremendous muscle power in those back legs. I know one of the things that we wanted to talk about when we thought Grant was going to be here, but do you remember it had to have been about 40 years ago, and it was even written up in Ripley's Believe It or Not, the man that was killed by a halibut, Joe Cash on the Flicka.
Yeah.
Now, I think Dad was saying he thought that Grant, as a young man, was there.
Yeah,
and
they were
everybody went-
fishing out there in front of him,
Yes.
and let's see who.
He was the last one.
John Stephens.
gone by.
I think John Stephens was out there too.
Yeah.
There's several of them there had been watching Joe fishing, but I think they turned and was heading back, didn't they? Before Joe underground there.
I don't remember. I know
I
he's talking
can't.
about it.
Yeah, I remember.
But he thought he was probably the last guy to go.
Yeah, I think they had.
Still moving out there, and then, so I think he was gone though.
Mhm.
Oh, Joe was quite a guy. He's a bachelor, and he was from Nebraska and Minnesota and around that country. And during the early part of the war, he came out to Seattle and worked at Boeing's as a machinist. and he and I don't know, he knew some fishermen down there at Lake Union, and he got interested in it. So him and one of his friends there, they bought a boat, little boat, 32-footer, and came up one year, and the other guy didn't like it. And Joe, I think he fished it a couple of years, and I think that's when we met him. I can't remember when, early 50s. And then old John, oh my God, what? Anyway, his son-in-law had a boatyard in Anacortes or LaConner, I think it was, and he built a Flicka. Mm-hmm. And Joe bought the Flicka, I think, the next year and fished it all those years.
Port Orford cedar with no butt joints.
No, it was 38 foot, and
Mark fished the Flicka too, didn't he?
yeah.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
And Joe and I, he was, like I say, he wore those striped overalls, farmer overalls, and he had about a dozen pair, he'd take to the cleaners, and then he had kind of khaki shirts and his striped overalls, and whenever he was in town, well, he'd come out and barb and feed him. He just loved, he'd always bring up a bunch of apples, and he had a lot of trades in stock. He'd take canned salmon back to Minnesota, and he'd trade it for this or that, and then he had a place over in eastern Washington where he'd get his apples, and he'd have several boxes of apples and stuff, to bring up. And he always ate with us when he was in town here. And Joe and I, years ago, I don't know, back in the middle 50s, some of those big old barn doors of halibut, they're so hard to kill. And they lay on, how they are, they lay on deck for 3 or 4 hours and then come alive and beat all your bin boards apart. And so I remember there at Tyee, we took the halibut and cut into their head trying to figure out the best place to shoot them, those big ones. And when they found Joe there, he was, I guess he had two. I think one was on deck and the other one was still on the leader over the side that had probably flopped itself over. The boat was laying over there, and Joe shot him all right, but they didn't get him. And I think what happened was the scuppers under the bin boards and stuff, he had his toes under, or one toe anyway, under that, and that halibut started flopping, and it then he had the hatch there, and it just broke his leg all. And this femoral artery just was wide open, so he tied himself to the anchor winch. It was the old style, where it's made out of a differential of a car and had the capstan on the head. And he tied himself on that, but the boat was still in gear, and he must have bled to death before it hit the rocks over there off Pinna Point. And so, yeah, I bought or helped Mark buy the Flicker from Joe's sister, and he fished it for quite a few years. It was just a kind of a stylish hull, and a lot had gone into it. Like I say, full-length planks, and but Joe was quite a character.
He had a little dog that we used to call the pirate dog because it only had one eye.
Jigs was his name.
Jigs the pirate dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, some sort of terrier or...
Well, I don't know.
It was kind of a mix.
Yeah.
Might have had some Scottish terrier or something
Yeah,
else.
it was something Scottish. He had longer hair. And
there was that empty socket. I remember that.
He had
This
an
kid was
apple.
Fascinated with it. Staring, we tried to see it. See it moving on that. Well, of course he couldn't. There was only one eye. I still remember Jiggs the pirate dog.
Joe had an apple box and a couple of gunny sacks tacked on it, so it was kind of bellied there. And that was his bed. He had to screw down to the deck in the galley when it got rough. Well, old Jiggs would get in his bed and right out to the weather.
Well,
I was fascinated in your book when how you talked your wife into moving here to Alaska.
Well,
And what was her impression when she got here?
Well, her folks are from Iowa, and Barb was a nurse, and I have to go back a little bit. My uncle, Dad's brother, had worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad for years. He started out as a telegrapher and an station agent. And then during the war, they asked him to go up to San Francisco and as administrator of the hospital system for the SP. And see I think it started at Portland, and then all through California and all the states. In fact, there was a SP line that run, I think, through Nogales down to a place called Topolobampo, Mexico. And so, there's a lot of employees. And this SP hospital took up the whole block. And they had, at that time, they were kind of segregated. They had a Mexican ward on one wing, and I think there was some black ward up above. And then, of course, they had the heart, what do you call it? Cardiac ward. And that's where Barb was working over there as a nurse. And I always said that I saw her naked before I ever met her. I was a steam engineer in the powerhouse. We made our own electricity, and then we had to take care of, all the things. The autoclaves, they'd get to leak and need a gasket. And we changed fluorescent bulbs and some. And one day my partner and I, we got I think it was a Sunday or something, and got a call that some lights were out in the nurses' dormitory. They had a dormitory there for the nurses until they could get apartments, And so, anyway, we went over there with our tubes and knocked on the door and yelled, "Engineers," 2 or 3 times, and nobody said anything. So we just went in and it's kind of hot in there, and there's all these gals with no clothes on, laying in their bed, the sheets pulled back. And pretty soon one of them saw us and started yelling. Barb called me a peeping Tom, and I said... And next time I saw her, yeah, she really got I said, we yelled. You didn't yell very loud. So the next time I saw her, I got a call that one of the elevators was stuck between the floors over in the cardiac wing. And so I went over there, and I yelled down into I said, well, it's going to take me a little while. I'm all alone here, and I got to go up on the roof of the penthouse and work a bunch of relays, and I'll try to bring it up to level it off pretty well. Well, she had somebody died there, and then her and the black orderly was taking the body to the morgue, and so she says, well, hurry up. And I said, yeah. So I went up there, and I had to get 4 screwdrivers in one hand and 3 in the other, and get them all pointed just right to push those relays in to bring that up. So I finally got it up, and of course she gave me hell. You're that peeping Tom. And I said, well, all you lewd gals laying over there, I said, you didn't have any covers on. How do we know? So then I went out to help a guy make out his income tax, and Barb was out there for dinner, and they asked me to drive her home, so I think we went with her 3 weeks or a month, and we decided we had something going there, and so I said, well, I'll be back in the fall, and so I don't want to wait till fall, so I was just beginning to write then. I'd sold a few articles and things. So I hawked my Corona typewriter, and she had a TV set, and we hawked those and worked another 2 weeks, and we had enough money to get back to Alaska, and I still had enough to fill up the gas tanks on the boat. So, yeah, she wasn't reluctant to come up. Oh, or you should have heard her folks howl, though. We got married to the traffic judge, did it, and they thought that was terrible. And then going to Alaska, and what about her career? I said, well, when I met her, she had put in an application as a nurse in the Air Force. And I said, well, I got her before she was an officer anyway. But, yeah, she just one of those 1 in a million, I would think, go out there the way it was back in, I think that was about 54 we was married. Been almost 60 years. 58, I guess. But, no, she took to it real good, and I kind of, the old Saltry site in Warm Springs Bank was a 5-acre site, and I had my eye on it because I had a stream there, and I figured I'd put a Pelton wheel in up, or a pipeline in, and get enough head to have, so we'd have water and power both. And so I inquired about it, and they just kept pushing me off, the Bureau of Land Management between this and that, Forest Service and this and that. And what had happened, it had been a herring saltery there, and then a plant later, and they had applied for patent but had never carried through it. They went out of business for it. So it was laying in limbo kind of between the. So Barb wrote to, you got to help me out, Luke, the old
Bob
Senator,
Bartlett.
Bob Bartlett.
Uncle Bob.
And I met him in Metlakatla one time. I was coming back in the States, and I told him, I says, Bob, we can't get no action there. There's and the one thing, there's a little lake up above there. It was called Sadie Lake. And they said, that's been reserved for a power site. So I told Bob about this, and I never thought I'd hear any more about it, but he had a special act of Congress go through that declassified this as a power source. I said, Jesus Christ, I can jump across this thing, and so by gosh, we got title to it. And about that time, a lot of these canneries were going out of business or consolidating and one thing and another, and used to be Whiz Fish Company, and then San Juan Canning and Packing, and then New England. They finally ended up with Tyee, and so they sold it to a fellow named Walker, and he was going around the country dismantling them, and selling lumber and everything. So he had about half of it done, and he asked me if I wanted to come over there and take over what was left. And And so we did. There was the superintendent's house was still there, and we had a place to stay. And I guess Mark was about 4 years old, and Mike maybe 2. And so we moved over there, and I worked on, the old cannery building. There's a lot of good wood in the bunkhouses, and heck, we got windows, and we got everything there. And in the spring, I had a big raft. I'd sold quite a bit of the lumber and roofing and one thing and another, and I had this big lumber raft made up. And Dutch, my younger brother there, he came over and with my boat and his tow, and we towed that over to the Saltry site and pushed it up on the beach, at high water, and let the tide go out, tied her up good. And then it was time to go fishing, so Barb packed lumber there all one summer and kind of sorted it out and everything, and we built a nice big house. In fact, it's called the Wilderness Lodge there now, and they've built some cabins there, don't they, Luke?
Yeah.
Half a dozen
Mike
cabins.
Trotter there at the Baranoff Wilderness Lodge. The
Yeah.
Same building. They've added a dormer and put
Yeah,
up small cabins for their clients.
yeah.
And
It was
they
kind
have
of a unique site.
quite a bit of kilowattage there on the.
Oh, yeah. Well, I knew that there would be
The potential, yeah.
but in Warm Springs there, when Duke and I bought that, they had an old DC generator there, and then they'd put a DC motor on the washing machine, and I don't know I don't think there was any freezers there or not. But anyway, as soon as we got it, we got a surplus magazine and ordered a AC generator. I think is about 3,500 watt, and it was enough we had to juggle things. When they do the Barb or Mom would wash, well, turn off lights, if they was running the freezer and the washing machine or something. But we had that, the store building, we had, goods out there. It was cut off from the living quarters and upstairs, and so we needed heat there. And so about that time, everybody in Petersburg was getting rid of, the old cast iron radiators. And every time I'd come to town, I'd see, I remember Hack White was down there, and he had some of those. I got a bunch from him, and they was great. I'd pipe a series of those through the store, and it just kept it nice and warm. The canned goods didn't freeze or anything in the winter. And I cleaned out the the radiators in Petersburg pretty well. And so it really got down in our heating bill too. I had it upstairs, and it was pretty nice. But it was something for young people. It was some of our happier years were there. But when you're young, and good health, and your kids, Barb taught all of them. But Luke is, by my first wife, was married just about a year, just about enough to get him, and it was the best. He was the best thing that came out of their marriage. See, why came down and got you about when you was 10.
61. 61 is when my mother died and I came up here.
Yeah.
I could tell you a story. I was 10.
Yeah, he was 10.
I'm 6 years older than Mark.
Yeah.
Or no, 4 years older than him, 6 years older than Michael.
Yeah.
And then, 18 years older than Leif and 19 years older than Patrick.
Yeah, we just kind of had a double family there. I was going to get one of those 52-foot Skookum hulls, and retire about 50. Oh, what a dream. And then one day, Barb, she's been acting kind of funny. And she said, "Are you in a good mood?" And I didn't say anything. And finally I said, "You're pregnant." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Barb, I really got some serious business to do in Juneau. And I know it was kind of a dirty pool, but I chartered a plane, went to Juneau, and got a little bent out of shape with my friends, and I come and repeated it in
I
Petersburg.
was thinking, my dad always had elaborate names for the family dogs. There was Michael J. O'Toole, there was Abraham P. Finkelstein. They all had full names. And I think one of the neatest stories, Finkelstein, Fink for short, would go down on the floats in Warm Springs and beg food from the boats. And he was quite good at it. Anyway, Barb one time was just mad at him for doing that. So she stood at the head of the ramp, and there were several boats in, and one of them was a
They were bear hunters.
Ralph Young, bear hunter.
Yeah.
And she started yelling, Abraham Pete Finkelstein, get your ass up here. And he wouldn't come. She kept yelling out his whole name. Because, well, she did it with us too. It was Luke Preston Short when I was in trouble. You know, mothers do that. They use the whole name when they're in that mood. So anyway, she was yelling, Abraham P. Finkelstein, get up here right now. Well, after about 4 or 5 times hollering this guy got off of Ralph Young's bear hunting boat and walked all the way up the ramp and says, yes, ma'am, did you want me? Now, do you think he would have believed if she said, I was just calling my dog? Who has a dog named Abraham P. Finkelstein? So needless to say, she was kind of embarrassed because the guy didn't believe her. But I always thought that was one tremendous coincidence.
He was a hell of a trout thief. You know, they get with those cut treats. People go up and fish the lake, and they cut a fork in a little blueberry branch or something, out and feed the gills on. And old Fink, he'd come down to the cabin we were staying in with one of those in his mouth, God, he would steal everyone. If they weren't watching close, they'd be standing out there in their waders or something in the creek, and the old Finkelstein would just walk up and grab their fish and take off.
He'd always bring them home.
Yeah.
That one gal one time says, what kind of dog is that to Dad? And he said, Australian trout retriever. Right off the top of his head. Another thing Fink would do, he'd go over to the creek and he'd catch these humpies and he'd bring them over and lay them in the bear grass right in front of the house.
Oh, yeah.
Which would bring the bears in. One time Mom was sitting there reading. We were up this high to floor level on the house, and she's sitting on the couch reading, and we're all doing schoolwork, taking a nap. She felt like something was watching her. She turned, and here's the window, and right there was a bear standing up looking.
On his hind legs. Yeah, no mama
She said
bear.
she didn't even blink. She just kept looking until the bear lost interest. But that's a little close to an 8-foot tall bear.
I always had a 30-06 loaded right by the door, but just in case, but I was hoping that she'd never have to, but you can't keep those kids in the summer, and they out there, they loved playing that creek, but boy, it was a lot of bears there. But usually, Fink would bark and wise you up to him, but that time he must have been in or something too, or something, didn't smell him.
Well, since you're talking about bears and we got the camera rolling, can you tell the story about your bear encounter that's in Cheechakoes?
Oh.
Probably the first one
Yeah.
recorded in the book.
When the one tried to get Dookie.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've got a good picture of that down in my apartment. Gil and her friend, I hadn't seen him in 40 years now, Bud Daniels. And he just started drawing 3 years ago, and I can't believe it. So anyway, when this happened, back in the I don't know, it had to be in the 60s, didn't it, or something? But anyway, I wrote the story up, and it was just a natural, so I just wrote it up and sent it in to my agent in New York, and he took it over to Outdoor Life or one of those magazines. And the artist had drawn it partly on about 2 pages there. So I showed that to Bud, and he took it, and I told him where it was, and in Surprise Harbor, and so he had pictures of the light out there at Point Gardner, looking toward Baranof, and redrew it, and with Duke beating this bear over the head. Well, what had happened, that was the winter that I was over there wrecking the cannery. And Duke had come over there to hunt, because Baranof is so straight up, And they'd come, he and the Dutchman, my younger brother, we called him, he got his words all mixed up, and Dad had been in Germany in World War I. And so he called him the Dutchman because, like shut my door wide open and stuff like that, So we called him Dutch. And he and Duke were over there, and he went up in the back of the flats or somewhere. And Duke and I went out to this point, and we flipped a coin to see who's play dog. And there was we'd shot deer off of that point for years. There was a big log still there.
Still there.
Somebody, Joe told me it was.
Yep.
It must have been 5 or 6 foot through, and it's fairly short, maybe 20 feet long or something, and the high tide had taken it up there, and it's been there ever since I can remember. And we'd usually, one guy would play dog and take the skiff over to that. And it was kind of a high water island. It was a sand spit in between, and at real high water, there'd be 3 or 4 inches of water in it, or maybe 6 inches. And so I lost, and I went over there, and I saw a deer over there, and I shot it, a nice buck. And while I was there, I saw a small brownie. So I was kind of careful. And I dressed out the buck, and then I heard a couple of shots. 2 or 3, I can't remember what. And what had happened is, the deer had winded me, and they ran across that spit, and Duke, there were several came across, and he picked out the ones he wanted, shot 2. And I got back, got my buck dressed, and got it back to the skiff, and started up the motor, and it just started around into that little bite. And here I see this big brownie. It wasn't the one I saw, but pretty good sized one, coming across that spit, just galloping, throwing water just like a draft horse, And I yelled and shut off the outboard, and there was a little bit of a swell there. And I yelled at Duke, and finally he heard me and turned around, and the bear was just almost on him. And he shot him a couple of times. He must have, he probably had 5 in his, to start with, one that Chamberlain's wore in the magazines. And anyway, he had a couple left, and the bear jumped on top of that log and come right off the end of it and drove Duke back in the water. And he got about this high, and he just switched. Well, he'd shot him twice in the chest coming down. But he had a .257 Roberts. It's pretty small for bear. And so he switched ends and hit him over the head. And I was back in this skiff trying to, shoot. And I was looking right over Duke, and the boat was moving, the skiff. And finally, when he hit him, he went sideways and kind of under the water. And about that time, I lined up on that bear, and I shot a couple times, and then he was getting pretty sick by then. He turned around and started up, and then I broke him down in the back. But that was probably one of the closest ones we had there. It really messed up his rifle stock and his scope and everything. But we were talking other days. Duke's been in the hospital for damn near a month now, and he's really pretty bad shape. He's you know, oxygen. He's packing oxygen around, and then he get kind of a kidney infection. You know how that goes at all your organs. They kind of want to shut down. He's hoping maybe tomorrow or the next day they might let him out for a little while, but he's not in good shape at all.
I might mention that hide that they took off that bear was 10 by 10, so that was 100 square feet. That's a big
Yeah, but
bear.
it's
That's
a
bear.
big bear for, you know, down here.
That hide hung on one of the buildings in Warm Springs for years.
I don't know why we didn't, I don't know, of course, it cost money back then to have it.
100 square feet.
Yeah,
That's
it was,
impressive, isn't it?
For this country, it's a big bear.
But Dad was just saying that that was one of the closest ones, but there was another time when you had a deer on your back and came around a deadfall and a bear was about from me to Bev.
No, it's actually, there's some down timber, and it was laying almost like that log, and I had the deer on the pack, made up the pack on my back, and I it was about that high, so I had my gun like this, and I went on, crouched over to go under that log and clear it with that deer on my back, and there was a brownie just on the other side looking at me, just about 6 feet away, and I think we just scared the crap out of both of us. I didn't move, and he didn't either for a while, and then he turned around and got out of there, and I was awful happy to see him go. It was a good thing it wasn't a female with cubs or something. That's where you usually get into real trouble.
Well, if we've got time, maybe Dad could tell about the time he was at Tyee smoking fish with old Jess Payden.
Yeah, yeah, that was the winter we was over there tearing down lumber. I was, and Jess Payden had a boat called Repeat, kind of a halibut schooner type, and he'd come up from Port Alexander, him and his wife Lou, and he'd caught several big salmon there, and he brought them in, and so we had them I had a real nice smokehouse down kind of the trail toward the old powerhouse, and we had a bunch of alder cut up, and we were smoking those fish, and there'd been a lot of bears around there. You know, I'd see them, and I was really careful and we had one of the buildings there, I think it was old machinist bunkhouse. The windows were out and everything, but I had it kind of boarded over a little bit, and you know, it was in the fall and it's nice crisp weather, and I'd hang the deer there, you know, and then let them age and one thing and another, and the bears had been trying to get in there, so I was really kind of worried about the kids, and then so I told Barb to really watch them, you know, and of course you can't keep them in all the time in good weather. And all of a sudden I heard her yell, "Wayne!" and I thought right now, you know, the bear had one of the boys or something. So I grabbed my .6 and I had to lean against the smokehouse and put a shell in the chamber and started running up that trail in this blueberry bush and all over, you know, close kind of. And here comes this bear right down. I just stepped aside and I yelled, "Bear, Jess!" Jesus Christ. Man, he jumped into the smokehouse. And so I just knew that the bear had one of those kids. I went up there and she says, "No, they're all right. I got them in here." Said, "I just thought maybe you'd run into one coming back up." And I said, "Yeah, I almost did." So I talked there for a while, and finally, I better go see about Jess. And I went back there, and he was in there coughing. You know. I knocked on the door. I says, "Jess, what are you doing in there?" Yeah, old Jess.
There had been, it'd been about 16 or so years since I'd been on the boat with Dad. He had the 4 younger brothers to teach how to fish, and I was fishing with other people. But when Pat got out of high school, he went into the Marines. And Dad called me up and says, "What are you doing? Want to go king fishing, winter king fishing, maybe a little dungy? We'll go to the cabin and get some deer." I says, "Yeah, I'm in. Let's go." So we're out there talking one evening, and I said, "Dad, I know that Grandma killed brown bear and Pappy and Duke and Dutch and you." I says, "How many do you figure the Short family have killed of brown bears?" So Dad started figuring it out. Finally he says, "Well," he says, "I reckon right around 100.
Oh, I wouldn't think so. No.
Well, I says, "Well, how many of those did you have to shoot?" And he says, "Oh, I lose track, 32 or 34.
But I didn't ever shoot a brown bear that I didn't worry
Have to.
about.
I know it was always
If I could let him go, I would, but I was talking about Duke and the other day down there, and he says, "Wayne, I don't know how we lived through that without getting really chewed up." And he said, "Did I ever thank you for shooting that bear off of me?"
Well, I think one of the reasons why us 5 boys, and especially the time I've spent hunting on Admiralty and trapping there and wintering out there, one of the reasons why I didn't have bear problems is because Dad and Duke and Dutch, the rest of the family, had taken out the most aggressive ones. I really believe that.
Well,
that's
there
true.
was a hell of a bunch of brownies in that neck of the woods.
And they're coming to
and,
the call
you know.
now. Sometimes they come to the gunshot.
Oh, they'll come to a deer call, yeah. They're pretty wise at that, and they're so fast, you just can't believe how fast they move. They can, I've seen them kill a deer, just overtake it for a short distance, and they can just break its neck or its back. But yeah, I don't want them to do those very.
You gotta figure 3 seconds, 50 yards. That's what you gotta figure. They're terribly fast. You only have time for one shot.
But it was a good life, and for young people, and Barb, she, like I say, she taught the kids and never complained, and I was making good money fishing, so I had to go, and she helped the fort down, taught the kids and run the business there when we had that.
Your mom sure seemed like a hearty soul.
She was. The poor soul didn't have much chance with Dad, drug her all over the West and finally up here. But it was kind of good when Duke and I bought that place in Alaska. She was, she'd over in Spice Harbor. She's all by herself over there, when we go fishing. She hated boats, was scared to death of them. And once we got over there, and she was really good there, taking care of the business in the store. And meeting people, seeing people.
She seemed like a very patient in the books.
Yeah, she was, well,
She put up with.
yeah, she was, remind me of my ancestors, primarily on my dad's side, but Mom came for that bunch too, that came out west in the early days. And they just really had a lot of strength, and they weren't complainers, and they just made the best of it. I wrote that last book I did on my great uncle, Luke Short, was well, he was a cowboy, and those made a few trips in those trail herds going from Texas up to, the rail lines in Dodge City and Abilene and those places. And then then during the Indian Wars there, he was a scout. Of course, you know, they'd grown up in the Indian country, and they'd fought Kiowas and Comanches in Texas, and so he was up there with, you know, during the Indian Wars there, the Sioux and the Cheyenne, you know. And what's that old general I'm talking about? Crook. He was up there as a scout for Crook, but his mother was a little bitty thing about, I doubt if she made quite 100 pounds, and just tougher than nails. They called her the doctor because she took care of all the people around there. And my great-granddad, he and the two older boys were taking corn and wheat to millers. Now, I don't know how far it was to where that mill was to grind it, and I think it's 30, 40 miles, and they got it all milled and were coming back, and these Comanches raided them, you know, started to overtake them, and the boys saw that it was losing proposition and trying to get their dad to give up the wagon and get on one of the horses and get out of there. He wouldn't go, and so finally the Indians got close enough. They'd stop their horses and hold their guns on the Indians. Then they'd quit there for a while, and then as soon as they'd start to run again, well, the Indians right behind them, and they finally shot an arrow, and it went through his back, or right through one of his lungs. And so the boys then cut one of the horses out of the team and threw the old man on and headed home, and they had to jump off of a riverbank and into this creek, but finally got away. And my great-grandmother, she got him home there and cut off their head, and then she had a silk handkerchief. She soaked that in whiskey and tied it on there and pulled it through and patched him up, I guess, and yeah, he lived to be almost 80. But that's the kind of people they were.
Was he the famous guy that they talk about down at the OK Corral and all that?
Well, yeah, and they call him a gunfighter, and I guess he was, but he was really a mild guy. He never started to fight, but he never turned from one either. He was just calm. You know, he never got flustered. And well, after he got out of guiding up there, he was up there when Custer was killed. Not with Custer, but with
Same campaign.
yeah, that General Crook had been sent up from Arizona, and Luke was guiding for him. And after that, well, I think he'd been around those towns, and he saw that gambling. That's a hell of a lot easier than out here in the brush and everything. And he got into that, and he was, had a good mind. He was good. Actually, he was a card counter. He could tell what had been played, and that's where your edge is. And he got into one of the top high-rolling gamblers, as they called them in those days, and he was good at it, and he got into clothes. He said when he quit guiding up there, he burned all of his old clothes, and he never wore anything near like that again. He was quite a Beau Brummel in his dress. And he killed quite a few guys in gunfights. Yeah, in Tombstone there in 1881, he killed another gambler. They got a sign up on the street if you've been there. I think it was 1881 in February. And then I guess the most famous was Jim Courtwright in Fort Worth. Luke had gone down there and gone into partners with a guy that had been in the restaurant business, and they bought this building, and they called it the White Elephant Saloon and Gambling House. And Jake Johnson, he took care of the bar and the restaurant, and Luke had the upper floor was all gambling. And one of his mother she was Irish, and they were named as Brumley, and one of the Brumley girls was in her teens, and she told everybody about going up and living with Luke and his wife. His wife was a real beautiful woman, and she said, "Oh, it was so nice, and Uncle Luke just bought me all fancy dresses and all this stuff," and she just loved going. And at the restaurant, they had a dumbwaiter there, and they used to get Alaska ice. They would come into San Francisco and then get on the train, and they'd have Alaska glacier ice there in the bar and the restaurant, you know. And she remembered that, and then they'd send it up on the dumbwaiter, you know, up to their apartment on the back of the building, the second floor. But she really enjoyed going up there with him. But Luke, he died in bed of Bright's disease at 39. Lived a lot in those 39 years, though. I've got an old tintype of his made when he was a cowboy, and the picture of his. But I had that picture, a late one of he and his wife, and when I did the book, I just could not find it.
What's the book?
Feel bad about it. What?
What's the name of the book?
It was just Luke Short, a biography.